Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Educational Assessment. I'm your host, Professor DeNobile, and today's episode is the history of assessment or how assessment has been used in the past. Um, so today we're going to be looking at assessment in the ancient world, and then we're going to jump to the 19th to 21st centuries, educational policy in the 20th century. We're going to really dive deep into that. And then historical events that redefine the roles of education and assessment. What I want you to take particular close notice of is the creation and evolution of assessments and their use of assessments over time, and how historical cultural events have shaped it, especially and particularly in the last 100 years. But we're going to start in ancient China, 2200 BC. China was the first to use assessment. And I want you to consider this for a second. Pretend you're an emperor in the ancient world, and you're controlling vast lands and overseeing the economic growth of goods and services in your nation. Who would you want working with and for you? It just makes sense that you would want the most skilled, the most intelligent, uh, individuals with the most leadership skills, and you would want to figure out what they have to offer you. And so, what um, leaders of nations in the ancient world, particularly starting in China, is they used assessments in order to sort through their citizenry to see who can work for me and best expand this empire. So that's how assessments were used in the ancient world. Fast forward to the 1850s and 60s to the Common School movement, which is also known as the public education movement, who was founded by Horace Mann up in Massachusetts. Um, Other things that we really need to understand to really wrap our heads around the common school movement and this time frame is it's the intersection of many different things, particularly in the United States, is the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and then particularly in the US is the American Civil War. And so public schools were created because we needed a competent citizenry in America. Um, Proponents of the common school movement looked to Prussia in Europe, and they saw for 100 years prior, the Prussian school movement was able to create a citizenry that through education, through public schools, they were able to question the government less and less in order to recruit them as adults into, particularly men at the time, into the military. So they saw that the public education system in Prussia was able to mold a citizenry that the government best wanted for the purposes of their particular needs in society. And so proponents of the common school movement said, hey, what Prussia did there for their military, we're going to create our system for truth, justice, and the American way. That was the intent behind the Common School movement. What they did for monarchy in Europe, we're going to do for democracy in America. And how are we going to do this? We're going to do this through the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Because I'm going to hold off on the because I'm going to say it in about a second. But anyway, you had these one-room schoolhouses assessing children to see where they need to go in life, because you can't live on your farm, live your life on your farm anymore, and just be within your own world. You have to be a contributing member of the greater society, and so education develops a competent workforce so that around 9 or 12 years of age, you could go off into society, in the workforce, you could work in mills, you could work in factories, you could work to be contributing members of society, or you may go back to the family farm. And if you're going to go back to the family farm, you're going to go back more competent and be able to manage that farm more competently. Again, that was the argument behind the common school movement. Or if you showed that you had particular leadership skills, you might move on to higher education and be a part of the educated political elite of our country. Um, and so that was really, really the mindset of this common school movement, that because of the Industrial Revolution, because of all these changes in society, we really need a competent workforce in order to meet the demands of an ever modernizing world. While this is happening, um, we also have the scientific revolution happening in the early 20th century. In the late 19th, early 20th century, scientific methods are being applied to the study of infancy and childhood. So we got to go back to Charles Darwin. He publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859, and um, he initiates this study of the child by suggesting that development of the infant mirrored the development of human species. So we start off by studying animals, applying the scientific method and studying animals. And now we have these public schools and we have these children in them. And you're like, they're kind of like little animals when you think about it. Well, if we're going to observe the behavior of animals, why can't we observe the behavior of children? And so we start seeing this transition. And if any of you took the course with me last semester on um, developmental and educational psychology, you started seeing a lot of this. We didn't really say it in those terms, but you started seeing the rise of applying the scientific method to children, and therefore being able to then apply it to these findings to education. The other things about Darwinism was he had these concepts of like survival of the fittest. Um, and this started what was known as the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement aimed at improving the genetic quality of human populations by making sure only certain populations participated in the gene pool. The argument was that this would eliminate the social ills of society through genetics and heredity. We also have the concept of social Darwinism, which is applying the concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest to sociology, economics, and politics. This movement that starts in the late 19th century goes all the way to the 1970s, and we'll touch upon it later on. But you have the rise of the child study movement with individuals like G. Stanley Hall, Lewis Terman, Arnold Gesell, and John Dewey. And what these individuals did, Stanley Hall establishes a major child center. He mentored John Dewey, Gesell, and Terman. He also knew Horace Mann. He knew him directly. Also, he goes across the country. As I said, he establishes a university to develop education on child psychology. And most of his findings have now been discredited, but we have to understand that he was a pioneer in the field. Terman brings the Binet-Simon test from France and standardizes it in the US at Stanford University with about 800 children. He creates the concept of general intelligence as we know it today, and also measuring intelligence. You might have heard of the IQ test or the intelligent quotient test, which was created in 1916, and it separated out individuals. It made us question, like, what makes a gifted person why are they so gifted? Are they normal? Are they as quote unquote, I'm using this broadly, abnormal? Are they as abnormal as individuals with cognitive disabilities? Abnormal in the sense of not that they're abnormal humans, but abnormal in the terms of that normal psychology, someone with normal psychology is somebody who lands in the middle, especially in terms of intelligence. But what about these individuals on the extremes? What about individuals with very high intelligence or individuals with very low intelligence? Um, and really, like, this was a time where intelligence was very big, not only in education, but we also see throughout the 20th century we become very obsessed with the concept and idea of intelligence and how intelligence can contribute to society. um we're going to hear more about term in a second. um Giselle looked at maturation and milestones, and then John Dewey talks a lot about really when we talk about education reform in its purest form. John Dewey pushes for the education of children within this common school movement that you have to start early in order to really make um, vast strides in education later on. Uh, and whenever we think of education reform, John Dewey is the central individual, especially during this time. That is a typo, which I will correct. John Dewey could not have been born in 1959 and pass away in 1952. He was born in 1859 and passed away in 1952. So I apologize for that. This brings us to World War One from 1914 to 1918. The U.S. enters the war in 1916, equipped with Terman's IQ test. And I'm using this pun on purpose. We can now measure military intelligence or the intelligence of individuals entering the military. So the idea of going into World War One was that we could be able to measure the intelligence of the soldiers, and pick out the best and the brightest to be leading um, our armies. For those of you who don't know that much about World War One, we didn't officially enter World War One. We actually served under French forces, but our leadership was oversaw our troops, but our leadership reported to French leadership. So that's a little bit of a distinction. Yes, we fought, but we never really officially fought, if that makes sense, because we served underneath French leadership during World War One. With that said, we used the term and intelligence test in order to get the best and the brightest in leadership roles, because reality, if you understand this in terms of war, it didn't matter if the infantry was highly intelligent, because majority of them, unfortunately, or a good number of them, were going to die in battle. And so you didn't want the best and the brightest dying in battle. So what the military did was, well, we'll give them this term and IQ test, and we'll be able to really filter out the best and the brightest so that we can keep them, so that the best and the brightest are the ones making all of the decisions for all the other infantry who really just need to carry a gun. You don't need a lot of intelligence to carry a gun, to point a gun, and to shoot it. And so the frontline soldiers could have lower intelligence in that case. The concept and idea of, like, we're now going to outsmart the enemy in this way. We're going to use our best and brightest to outsmart the enemy. And this, you're going to see this on pretty much every slide moving forward. What is the role of assessment now? The role of assessment now is to be able to benefit the military. And oftentimes there's a lot of things in history that start in the military and then go out into general society. Assessment is another one here in the United States. Um, and by the end of the war, going into the early 1920s, we now have over 100 standardized tests developed to measure school achievement. We're able to sort kids and guide them where we feel they need to be. One of the biggest ones in the 1920s, it was first given in 1926, is the SAT, the Student Aptitude Test. Um, and this was to predict success in college, maybe even in a particular college, and it became a gatekeeper measure in terms of making sure we have the right students going to the right colleges and making sure that um, you know a student of lower aptitude, I'm going to use that word instead of intelligence, a student of lower aptitude that would be proven not to be able to be successful in college doesn't go to your Ivy League schools, because your Ivy League schools, you just want your best and brightest to go there. And so now, like, what is the role of assessment now? The role of assessment now is to really sort out uh predictors of success. Predictors of success are only going to go to our best colleges, because if you're not proven to be the best of the best or to be able to be successful, it doesn't matter what college you go to, but you're not going to go to Harvard, you're not going to go to Yale, you're not going to go to our best colleges. You're going to go to maybe the small local college in your town, because does it really matter if you go to Harvard or Yale? Well, to the country, it might. So we're going to use a test to be that gatekeeper to prevent you from going there. As we all know, fast forwarding 100 years later, the SAT and the ACT later on isn't really used as much as it used to in the early to mid 20th century, and even to the mid to late 20th century. It really has lost that centralized um, you know factor in college admissions. Um, this now brings us. Oh, let's just do a quick summary, mid presentation summary. So as we said, we looked at China in 22 BC using tests to select individuals for government jobs. In 1803, we have standardized testing widespread in Europe. 1915 is the first widespread of use of standardized tests in the U.S., especially during in the Army in World War One. The Stanford Binet IQ scale is developed, and then by 1918, we have more than 1,000 standardized tests that have been developed to assess school achievement. And by the 1920s, you have the SAT established to promote fairer comparison, or what has been argued to be fairer comparison of college and university applicants. Fast forward now, post World War II, we're in the 1950s, and a lot now is going on. I'm going to make the screen bigger. I had a lot of notes that I wanted to make sure that I covered, and then the rest of my notes are pretty much on here, and I'm pretty comfortable from the 1950s forward. So a lot is now going on in post World War II America. Economically speaking, we've been put on the world stage as a very fast growing, economically bolstering. We're a big country now. We're not just some post colonial burgeoning country. World War One established us as a contender. World War II made us like we're gonna be not just a contender in the world. we're going to be making decisions in the world. We're going to be part of the elite of the world. That's what happened after World War II. What also happened after World War II is, after fighting the Nazis, after fighting fascists in Europe, it was kind of a lot of what was happening in the early 20th century was a fight between fascism and communism. In a way, it became a necessary evil to work with communist Russia to defeat the Nazis. Therefore, although we don't like to really put it in those terms, we don't like to admit the role of Russia in World War II. Like, we needed Russia in order to defeat Nazi Germany. And that's what happened. Well, now, post World War II, we didn't know, like, can we trust the Russians? And so there was a lot of fear around communist Russia, communism, especially in the United States. We have the rise of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Senator McCarthy was one of the leading senators in the U.S. that led this drive against communism in the 1950s, and it became known as the Red Scare because it went to the point of a witch hunt. And if any of you have ever read the play The Crucible, even though is about the Salem witch trials, it is a satire on McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the 1950s. We have the Cold War and the space race. And this moment in time is Sputnik in the late 1950s. It was either 57 or 58. When Russia launches Sputnik, it put America in a tight spot, because how could Russia be the first to get to space, even in a material sense? How could they be the first? So the problem was our educational system. We were not preparing Americans to get ahead. So we have the rise of STEM education. If you've ever wondered why STEM education has such a big presence in education today, it started in the 1950s with the space race. On the other end, social cultural issues that are starting to bubble up in society is the civil rights movement. It really starts with Brown versus Board of Brown versus the Board of Ed in 1954, which declared Plessy versus Ferguson as unconstitutional. That was an earlier Supreme Court case. That separate but equal is not constitutional, and therefore we must desegregate our schools. And then it comes to the lynching of Emmett Till soon after Brown versus the Board of Education. I want to say 1956, if I'm not mistaken. 1955, excuse me. Emmett Till was lynched in August of 1955. For any of you who never heard of Emmett Till, he was a 15-year-old boy from Chicago, goes down to Mississippi to visit family. He allegedly whistled at a white woman who was married to a member of the Klan. They kidnap him from his uncle's home down in Mississippi, and they brutally lynch him. And this starts the modern civil rights movement as we know it. It launches. We're celebrating Martin Luther King on Monday. It launches Martin Luther King as a national figure in the civil rights movement. And soon after is the Montgomery bus boycott. But we now have the civil rights movement. We have the space race and STEM education, and these are coming they're intersecting now in the 1950s. And so now what becomes the role of assessment and the role of education? the role of assessment and the role of education now have to become a means of making sure that the best and brightest are going into STEM, because we need them to fight the Russians. That's what we need to. We need to win the space race. We need to win the Cold War. That becomes the role of assessment and education. And in theory, and there's a reason why I'm saying theory, in theory, it's also supposed to be a means of monitoring equality and educational equity, and making sure that everyone in society is being educated and everyone has access to free and public education. Some of the other pictures that are on here, this is 1969, wasn't the 1950s, but this was us landing on the moon in 1969. And down here in the bottom right is the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, which became another milestone in the desegregation movement in schools. This brings us to the 1960s with the war on poverty. So while we're moving forward in the Cold War, in the civil rights movement, post assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ becomes president, and he declares the war on poverty. So what was the war on poverty? It was putting federal funding into low-income areas of our country. The idea of a rising tide raises all ships. So if we're going to, if we fight poverty, it will be a great equalizer to fight poverty. That was the theory behind the war on poverty. We start getting a lot of these programs that are quite familiar today. Head Start was established in 1965. This had to do with preschool funding. Title I funding also starts in 1965. Bilingual education starts in 1968. Home Start is a function of Head Start, but with the idea of providing funding in order to help parents preschool while the children are still at home. How can we help start the education of children before they even get into their first classroom? So these are a lot of these programs that come out of the 1960s. They mandated program evaluation to assess children's progress. So now the role of assessment and the role of education are now changing, because now, if you notice, this is about funding. We're now attaching money to these programs. And even though we had to fund programs before, this now starts changing the role of assessment, because we need to evaluate, are we spending our money wisely? And so there's this subtle underneath. What is the role of education? The role of education now becomes the rising tide to raise all ships. If we're going to focus on poverty, that becomes a racial equalizer. That becomes an economic equalizer. This becomes now it's the rising tide, again, to raise all ships. But what's the role of assessment? Are we spending our money wisely? And this, you're going to see, is going to further develop as we go into the 1980s. Oh, we're going backwards in time. We got to go forward. Starting with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So two tests that I want you to look up is the PISA test and the TIMSS test. Here. So these two tests, which are developed, if I'm not mistaken, late 70s. And we get our first real results. These two tests are international tests. They're to test to see the trends of education internationally. We can now compare US students, with European students, with Asian students in Asia. And I don't mean within the United States, I mean globally. So we can compare China and Japan with the United States. We can compare England and Germany and France with the United States. That's what these PISA and TIMSS tests were. And in 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education publishes this report that was entitled A Nation at Risk. And in it, it blamed public schools and higher education failing to make US students competitive globally. And so the goal isn't simply to get to college, to educate you in order to get you a job, like the industrial model was. We now have to look at critical thinking. How are we going to now be competitive on the global stage? The eugenics movement was ended in the 1970s. We spoke about that earlier. And we see a lot of special education reforms in the 1970s, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was renewed in 1990, and then IDEA was passed in 1994. And we have a lot of our concepts now in special education, like IEPs, Section 504s, all of those things that you're learning in all of your courses dealing with special education today. But now, what is the role of assessment and the role of education? The role of education now is not simply to worry about our issues within our own borders. It's to measure, well, first off, the education is to help us become competitive on a global market. What is the role of assessment? The role of assessment is to see, because remember, we're attaching funding now. Which schools, which school districts are keeping up and meeting our goals? There's a lot of goals that were set in A Nation at Risk. Are we meeting the goals so that by the year 2000, we are going to be competitive on the national stage? Well, the year 2000 comes and goes, and we find out not much changed between the 1980s and the year 2000. So in 2001, George W. Bush signs No Child Left Behind. It expands the federal role in education. Before this, education was only a state-run affair. It's not mentioned in the Bill of Rights. So because of that, it was the Ninth Amendment. I gotta go back and check my amendments. I believe it's the Ninth Amendment that says any of these rights that are not mentioned go back to the individual and the states. Education is not mentioned. Therefore, education is a state-run affair. Well, similarly, when it came to voting rights in the 1950s and 60s, the government expanded its role to make sure that the states were fairly applying vote rights in their states. So the argument here came, we need to make sure that we are fairly applying education within our states. It put the lofty goal that by 2013, students will be at or above grade level. We see the accountability movement starts in the 1970s. However, it really takes off during this time. We really see a rise of state report cards. Which states are the best at preparing our students to be competitive globally? 2013 comes and goes. We don't meet the mark. 100% of our students are not at or above grade level. And in 2015, under Barack Obama, he doesn't change No Child Left Behind much in the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, He puts more money into early childhood education. That's one of the biggest differences. More research and development. And the biggest difference, which a lot of you might be more familiar with because these have affected you directly, we have the rise of national standards, which was very controversial because, as we said before, education before the 21st century was a state-run affair. Um, Better known as Common Core. Common Core has come and gone. We're now going into next generation standards. But now, what is the role of assessment? What is the role of education? Um, education now is about making sure all students are being taken care of. What's the role of assessment? Assessment now becomes the gatekeeper of accountability. It becomes which states, which school districts, which schools are best preparing their students according to our national standards of best preparing our students. That becomes the changing role of assessment during this time. So, our quick summary: 1950s, you had the Cold War, Brown versus Board of Education in 1953. So you have this intersectionality between STEM and desegregation. 1960s, you have the War on Poverty, Head Start, criticism of standardized tests begin. The 1970s is when the accountability movement begins, of using assessments as a form of accountability on states, on school districts, on individual schools. In the 1980s, you have the nation at risk, which leads to the rise of curriculum-based, performance-based, authentic, and alternative assessments. You really see the standardized test movement, even though it happened before the 1980s, it ramps up with the accountability movement that we're going to hold states, school districts, and schools accountable by using standardized exams in order to make sure that the benchmarks that we want to hit, that all of these stakeholders are meeting them. After 2001, you have the rise of the state report cards, which is still a part of that accountability movement. I copied and pasted that first slide for the summary thing. I probably forgot to take off that 1920s. I apologize for that. I believe here's our overall summary. It has been the role of assessment in schools to sort children. Global events have led to many changes in the direction of education policy and assessment. Assessment has played a major role as a gatekeeping measure for government, schools, programs, etc. And today, educational assessment pays special attention to non-biased test construction. I want to say, at least, like with a little asterisk, at least in theory. The theory is that assessment is supposed to be non-biased. As we know from history, as we know from social injustices that occur in society, we see that this doesn't always happen. But in theory, that's what it's supposed to be. And our purpose, because, as always, our mantra: assessment drives instruction. Is assessment perfect? No. But what assessment allows us to do is apply the scientific method to education. It provides a measuring tool, a measuring device, in order for us to see, is our instruction effective? Well, if we provide a test that's valid and reliable, we're able to see, does A plus B equal C? It should equal time. A plus B should always equal C. When we have an assessment to measure, are we always getting to C when we're doing A and B? All right. That concludes episode 2. I'm going to do my homework in fixing up these slides, and I look forward to speaking with you in episode 3, which will be about high stakes and standardized testing. Talk to you soon.